All right, welcome everybody. This is Leadership 2.0. We are here to learn a little bit more in the leadership realm and delighted to have Kathy Ellis with us today. We know that Hurricane Zeta came through last night and we have lost a number of our participants due to lack of power. So we are recording so that they will be able to catch up. Delighted to have Kathy Ellis train us in this first of three in a series. I am now going to turn it over to her. Welcome, Kathy.
Oh, thank you so much. And I really want to thank leadership very much for providing a platform and talk about my favorite subject, which is culture. And I mostly work with national cultures, but certainly we can look in cultures in many different ways. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll start the famous slideshow here. And just as Catherine indicated, part of my job, you can't separate language and culture. And so I blend the both. It's cultural instruction, and it's also English as a second language in the workplace. So my last name is Ellis, and I always say, you know, if you can remember Ellis Island and just remember my last name, that's just fine, because I really do work with immigrants. And part of it, I put here my cultural journey, and most of it is because I started out in small town USA in the Midwest. And while there were, you know, my family, my grandparents were from the United Kingdom, and then my other set of grandparents had German in the home, that was about my only influence. And it wasn't until I went to elementary school and I saw the high school exchange students. And I was just fascinated because they had different color and they talked in different ways. And about fourth or fifth grade, I said, I'm going to become an exchange student too. I kind of like this. So I had a great deal of curiosity, and it was, things were so different. So then in high school, I was an exchange student to the Netherlands. And at 17, that was the first time I went on an airplane. That was the first time I stayed in Amsterdam, that I went in an apartment. I was raised in the countryside. So there were all these differences that were quite overwhelming, but at the same time, it was quite adventurous. And then here in Atlanta, I've worked in, well, actually my degrees at Michigan State University, East Texas State University, and Lesley University, which is near Cambridge, Massachusetts. My first job when I graduated from the undergrad was in Guatemala. And I thought, where is Guatemala? I thought it was an island in the Pacific. But I went there on an internship from Michigan State. And that was kind of also another beginning where I ended up being 10 years overseas, living in 6 countries. And one door kept opening to another door, to another door, and to another door. And with that, I learned Spanish, and I learned it really intensively that I could teach it at the university. So that was during my 20s. And then later on, I learned Portuguese. And I mixed those 2 languages up very, very well. And then after that, it became kind of this fever of traveling all over. And I traveled to about 41 countries and just kind of traveled deeply. I'm not a very good tourist. I'm a traveler. And it's also part of my vocation. It is what I do, and learning about the depth of culture, the mindsets of culture. And in the Atlanta area, and even in the Sandy Springs area, is that I worked with American Intercontinental University. Troy University is an Alabama university, but they do have a location in Sandy Springs. So mostly I worked with the international students. And I also taught undergrad courses. And presently I'm at Gwinnett Technical as teaching English as a second language. A lot of my work is USA orientations for international newcomers, and I'll source out with different destination services. And then also advance English in the workplace, American style professional skills. and then kind of toning in or tweaking the English. Test preparation. Also, I give assessments to gauge numerically where one is at in engaging differences, and that's called the IDI. And then different workshops and debriefs. My strong suit is Latin America, definitely, and that would be with Brazil. The first Lunch and Learn, we're going to have a series. Our second one is November 19th. Instead of 11:30, it'll be at 12. And then on December 17th, it'll go back to 11:30. So, and it's all with the cultural lens. And then this is the idea of our agenda. So what I'd like to ask you, our participants in the chat, if you can locate the chat room, is we talk about culture. So what is culture? What does it mean? And you can go ahead and put it in the chat box. How would you define culture? Okay, so Catherine says, I'll go back a little bit. I didn't know this about Catherine. You moved to the Philippines as a kid, and I didn't know where that was. So that's pretty amazing. So absolutely, culture, part of it is geographic identifiers, unique ways of doing things specific to your region. Jeanette said customs and tradition. Tiffany said, for me, it's a collection of customs attributed to a population. And then Prime's iPhone is norms, beliefs, traditions related to your family, country, and etc. So those are all. So in general, culture is a group of people who share ideas and values and traditions. And although mostly I work with country cultures, but culture, we live in the southeast of the United States. It certainly is very different from the northeast of the United States. So all countries within their own country also have very defined cultural parameters within their regions. And one would say, well, Georgia is very different from Alabama. How is that? Okay, so that can also go into, so it's kind of interesting. You can go to gender culture, sexual orientation culture, age. So it's all these different groups that share the values and the ideas. The next thing that I'd like for you to do is go ahead in the chat box. One thing that reflects a culture would be the proverbs that one uses. Perhaps it's the expression in a proverb. For example, blessed is the child who stands alone. All right. That is definitely showing individualism. And in the United States, a high value on individualism. So can you think of any proverbs that you can put in the chat box that come offhand? There's a lot of them. Each one teach one. I like that one. I haven't heard that one before. That's great. Do you want to unmute? What do you mean by that? Go ahead and unmute and explain that one a little bit.
Hi, this is Tiffany Bell. It's an African American proverb, and one definitely I'd say for me, I grew up and heard often from my parents and my grandparents just about if you learn something, it's incumbent on you to make sure that you share that information with someone else.
Excellent, thank you, thank you. All right, I want to go to the next page, but this is very strange. Let me see. Catherine, is there a way that you can go in and advance the slide?
No, they're on your computer, so you have control. Maybe take it out of screen slideshow and see if you can get something.
We might have, yeah, just to show the, maybe not a complete slideshow, but just, I'll have to do it that way. Okay, oh, I love that. Janetta said, que Dios te bendiga. That's wonderful. Can
Yes,
you?
so I will explain family every time you greet, come in, go out. Que Dios te bendiga is God bless you. So that's very popular in the Spanish, Latin culture, and specifically the Puerto Rican culture. So
very good. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
You get to see a little bit of what I'm going to do next. Thank you. So here are some proverbs that might make a little bit of sense as it reflects Here, I love this one because I think when you are practicing, you know, certain cultures that even, it's like a dance, even if you put your best foot forward, you can still step on someone's toe. The intent is good, but when we're in different cultures, there's mistakes that are bound to be made. That's just part of the process. Of course, we want to minimize those possible mistakes, but that's all part of it. And so you can see the list of proverbs and what it may reflect. A rolling stone gathers no moss is the idea of busyness. American culture is very busy. Don't stay still. You have to keep going. All right, thoughts on culture. These are a couple of pretty common quotes in the culture, is that culture hides more than it reveals, and strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participant. Edward T. Hall also said, in order to get to know your culture much better is to leave it. And so you go, and then everything else, everything new gets checked, gets compared to the way that you grew up. And also Gandhi says, which is another quote that I really like, is that I do not want my house to be walled in on all sides and my windows to be stuffed. I want the cultures of all lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible, but I refuse to be blown off by my feet by any. So we still need to know where we're coming from and what is our self-awareness piece. And then also, how do we, in that process, go through the continuum of differences of different cultures. If you live in one culture for the first 20 years of your life, you become conditioned without knowing it. And so it might be one thing like, that's not how I was raised. This kind of thing where how we grew up is often how we feel is the right way. You might have heard this as the iceberg theory, and most of the iceberg is under the water. And that's the idea of culture. More directly that we can see in culture is what we can observe, and that's above the water. And so we might be able to observe some of the behaviors, the race, the customs, the music, the food, and so forth. But most, as you can see, is below. And that goes with the values and beliefs, the religion, the mindset. All of that takes time and practice to get to know. It's not easy sometimes. Okay, so here when we talk about culture lens, is this idea of kind of being like a detective. And so we're going to wear our special lens and kind of look at it this way, look at it that way. And these are some of what they call the cultural dimensions, considerations when we're interfacing with different cultures. And so an example today, what we're going to do is direct and indirect, and then also low and high context, and what does that mean? But you can see that there's other like fluid and controlled, collective, individualistic, task, relational, hierarchy, egalitarian, status, balance, internal and external, formal, informal, linear and non-linear thinking. Then also the idea of silence, body language, the nonverbals, and then the physical space. All right, so that gives you some idea. Now, when I say the lens, so for example, I might have, you know, I'm wearing my American glasses. We all have different prescriptions, and we see things in different ways. So I may be, okay, so Brazil is my forte. So I might say, okay, I'm going to go to Brazil, or I'm going to work in a Brazilian company. What is it that I need to know or I need to be aware of? So I learn all the kind of characteristics, and I put on my Brazilian glasses, and then that way I can kind of see what Brazilians see and how they interface. But there's kind of a problem because I still have my American glasses on, which filters also. Okay, So if to truly see what a Brazilian sees or any other nationality, I'm going to take off my American glasses and just put on my Brazilian glasses. That alone takes a lot of practice. Okay. And here, when we say like the low context and the high context, it's kind of interesting. So we have, it is a matter of the communication style and how one relates to the other. And so we have a high context and we have a low context. And when I say this, imagine a pendulum that kind of swings. And so we can temporarily swing the pendulum in certain ways. It's certainly not the extreme high and the extreme low all the time. So high context, what do we mean? Mostly they're saying listener centered. So it's up to the listener to get the message. A lot of times in a higher context society, the message is embedded. It's not so direct. So there's other characteristics that are coming with this as well. It's also, it depends who am I talking with? What is their age? What is their gender? What is their last name? So there's all these considerations that kind of define how am I going to interact in this scenario with this person. So there's much more protocol. That's it's like hierarchy driven. So much more protocol. Communication things that will work well with somebody from a high tech culture would be definitely a need for face-to-face meetings. Phone, they need to see your face, they need to call, hear your voice. If it's virtual, like we're doing everything now, you need to have the video on in order to see the face. Another thing that's going on is face saving. What is face saving? Face saving is the idea of not embarrassing the other person. You are considering all the time on how they feel. All right. And it's a matter of always keeping the honor, and if they have a certain kind of level, not to cause any kind of embarrassment. And so that's part of face saving. All right. So what you've probably heard, losing face, losing credibility, for example. You can have in the southeast part of the USA is a little bit more higher. It's a higher context than, let's say, northeast like New York is going to be much lower context driven. Low context is speaker driven. It's up to the speaker to give the message very directly, often in a linear fashion, very directly. It's content driven. So you see here I have content and I have context. And so it could be a blend of both, depending on which society it is. A lot of times when we think about it, even here in the US, we never need to meet the other person. So you may be in an office, you have a subsidiary, and for years and years, you just have kind of a telephone, you never really meet them. In certain other countries, that's doable, but it's rather a challenge to do because it makes a big difference. For example, even in the case I knew it was important. They were from a high context culture that I needed to meet them face to face. We wore a mask, we social distance, but it's the only time I've been doing that during the pandemic, only because I knew that it had a lot of value to it. And it was a potential client, which is now my client. So meeting for sure, I knew was very, very critical. So the low context also, it's just fine to emails, some phone, not necessary to meet. And of course, also this is changing a little bit as the instant messaging and all of that as young people all around the world using this. In the US, it's more like yes is yes and no is no. So somebody might be, when I was a kid growing up and I would ask my mom, can I do something? And she said, well, I'll think about it. And I always knew that meant no. So she's using kind of a more indirect, higher context approach in order to avoid the conflict. Higher the context, usually it's going to be avoidant conflict. It's not going to be, there's a sense of harmony that needs to happen. You also have, understand the various applications of silence and active listening. So in our case, it's very valued that people use the nuances, and they use their head and their nodding. In some cultures, it's not necessary. Also, silence has a different definition. It can mean a sign of respect to be silent at a meeting. So often I tell especially American meetings here, I say to the international newcomers, you must say something at a meeting. You cannot be silenced, because that implies this, and this, or it could imply. So it's things like that, little things, but very important things. So you see that the arrow here, we have the continuum, and the United States, as you can see, is on the lower context. Certainly not the lowest. So you have that directness, which I'm going to do next, and that indirectness. And so you can see that Germany is the low context. What is no, yes is yes. And even the United Kingdom, with despite the English and the influences that we have from United Kingdom, it's still a little bit, there's some differences, and the same with Canada as well. United States, out of those three countries, is the more lower context and a little bit more direct. Then you can have your Mediterraneans in here in the middle, and Mexico right here, very high context driven. Then Greece, and then the Arab speakers, and West Africa, countries in West Africa, and China. And I would definitely put Japan up here. I would put South Korea up here, most definitely. Any questions or any comments? That is that in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it. Okay.
No questions.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
No questions, but interesting observation. Even with how I correspond with my parents. My mom is from the Northeast, the more low context. My dad is of Puerto Rican descent. And for her, it's a quick, like, hello or text messaging is the preference of us checking in. And with my dad, it's like, I have to call him, like, hear his voice, because if I text, it's never going to happen. Like, he won't respond. So even just thinking about that in the way you summed it up, it's just triggering. I'm like, okay. And you learn, obviously, the different ways to interface and interact with individuals. So it's pretty spot on.
Absolutely. I have a very good friend from Chile. We've known each other for 40 years. To this day, I know that when I call, I need to go through a certain protocol. Even though she's adopted a lot of the Americanisms, I also know that there's a protocol there that I need to. I don't feel like I have to, I just know that that's part of the relationship, is to go through that protocol and ask, how's everything? How's the family? This kind of questions. So it's quite different from the low context, isn't it? Where you may not even ask about the family, or it may not be something that you do is ask about the family. Also, a part of this too is the idea of public speaking. So usually in your higher context, you have if a person is a very good public speaker, then that is very important for higher context cultures. That is also in Latin America, your public speaker there, and then also in the Arab world, in the Middle East, is to be a very strong public speaker. So we're going to go into direct communication, and again, it's a continuum. So in the verbal sense, it tends to be even blunt sometimes. And again, despite, US being kind of that low context and very direct kind of culture, it still has some consideration of politeness, I guess is what we want to say. And you also, by the way, you have to define the word polite. What is polite in one culture may not be polite in another culture. So we have to redefine the word polite. We have to redefine the word honesty. What does honesty mean? And we have to redefine the word respect. So also in that, so as we travel from culture to culture, what is considered three of those things: honesty, respect, and politeness. So even in that, to be blunt, and again, that may not work so well in the Southeast. and it may be small town. So you have a small town culture and you may have a big city culture is also functioning in different ways. Nonverbal language only supplements or emphasizes the words of the message. It's not so much with the nonverbals as it is with the word itself. People place high importance on individuality and freedom of expression. The idea of saving face is less important than being forthright and honest. So I know if I'm working with a German company, I have to be as honest as I can. And I also know, or else the trust is not going to be there. So when I first started working, this was years ago with a German company, is that I was giving English classes. And I would say, wow, you're doing a really good job, you know, and encouragement and all of that. And they go, no, I'm not. I'm doing terrible. And they, you know, so I learned not to compliment that in anything, because it's the idea there's might be the perception of a falseness to it. Also the idea of smiling too much is another thing. So in the lower context, they're smiling less. All right. And so this is also building that trust relationship, the idea of that. So there's a lot of components here. Efficiency of communication takes precedence over style and eloquence. Let's get it done. Let's get the task. This is this. I don't have to know the person. We're doing a task together. People require less context and background information. They just want to get the gist. They just want to get it done. Silence or hesitance is off-putting and often viewed as a sign of inattention, maybe not interested in it. So silence has kind of a negative connotation, the more direct cultures. Feedback, usually despite, especially in the US, even though you're giving critical feedback, you have to make a sandwich, right? There's some consideration of the other person, saving face, not hurting their feelings. So you make the sandwich. This is something good. This is the critical part of it. And then going back to something good. So I've also worked with a German company on that too. Okay, signs of indirectness. And you have verbal language may suggest the intended message. There's going to be a longer, it's going to be kind of a spiral kind of interaction. There are going to be more words with indirect communication. Nonverbal language becomes very important, depending on the culture that you're working with, is the eyes. If I'm working with, for example, a South Korean culture, I'm not going to be waving my arms around. That's like I'm losing control. I'm out of control, okay? So I'm going to minimize my facial expression. I'm going to minimize the use of my arms. Silence and hesitance can be used as a tool for communicating, and they are often a way of showing respect. People require more context. They need more time. And again, going back to who are we, where are we, who is this person, what's their last name, and so forth. People prioritize group harmony over personal wishes. This is so true, especially in the Asian cultures, is that the harmony is the most important thing. And so that team and working together and keeping that harmony. People intentionally frame their message such that nobody loses face. Keeping the honor, the embarrassment, the hurt of feelings. Tone and eloquence are valued, okay? The way of speaking, as I mentioned before. Do you have any questions or comments coming from the indirect direct? All right, so I'd like for you, you can either unmute or put it in the chat box. Can you name the country? Now, this doesn't mean everything fits in this category clearly, but can you name the country that might be the most direct and name the country that would be the least direct? So the continuum, and in general, these are general things to point out. So if you guess Germany, you're right. And even the Swiss Germans, So again, it just depends. But in general, this is the continuum where you have the Netherlands, and usually these are Anglo-Saxon cultures, Northern European, more in directness, and then all the way to indirect. So Germany, Netherlands, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, again, United States, and again, you see the United Kingdom on the other side, and then Europe. So this can also, if you've noticed, like, going into your low context and your high context, now you can also kind of put these together with the directness and the indirectness. Okay, any comments or observations or?
There was a question about where Russia would fall on this list.
Oh, yes. Where do you think it would fall?
I thought it would be on the high direct.
I would be my guess too.
Oh, yes. Yes. I would definitely put Russia's a little bit kind of in the middle, or even more with the high context. But on the directness, absolutely, I would definitely put them on more of your directness. Absolutely. The Russian, the country itself would be around probably, it might even be, sometimes I feel like it's even more direct than Germany. So I think it's going to have this pendulum. I see it as sometimes I see Russia as the most direct country, and then sometimes there's a little bit of cushion, and it goes a little bit in a certain direction, maybe around Scandinavia.
Yeah, my father's wife actually is from Lithuania, and I know that, like, in conversations that we're having sometimes as a family, a lot of the American idioms she doesn't really understand. Like, they don't translate.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So so that's another thing. Like when we went with the proverbs and the idioms and things like that, sometimes there's just no translations or they might have some similar ones, but yeah, absolutely. Okay. So what I wanted to do here is, let me see how many participants we have here as a way of closing. Can we put, how many, Catherine, do we have? Do we have enough to make 3 or 4 people in a group?
Well, there's 6 of us, so if we include us.
Oh, well, maybe what we can do is just stay as a group then.
I think so.
Yeah, I think so too. What I was thinking, like in your own experience and in your own contributions, because we all come together with our backgrounds, travels, contributions, experiences. What is something that resonates with you? What is something that you hadn't thought about before, that now as you interface in all the communities, especially in Sandy Springs, in this area where we have a lot of small businesses and people, different immigrant communities, how does this influence any way that you interface with these different communities?
Do you want to take it off screen share and we can go see everybody?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you.
It might just be us. Okay.
Hey, it's Janetta. I'll say that I think it causes me just to pause and just being mindful, not just of the cultural differences, but also an understanding that people have come from different backgrounds, and those backgrounds create their experiences. And so in their perceptions of where they are today. And so I think that that's really what some of my key takeaways continue to be. And then, of course, just being open and at times sensitive to just different backgrounds, You know, having traveled abroad, you know, when I'm in undergrad and living in different parts of our country. I'm from the Northeast now, clearly live in Georgia. That has been a difference and an adjustment for myself as well. And then connecting within community, working and leading various types of individuals from those backgrounds. But I think those are some of those key pieces that I just keep at the forefront and just always pause it. And kind of what you said is just, you have your lens, but do your best to take off the glasses that you have to better understand.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes.
One custom I observed in China when they clink the glasses, so I'll try to demonstrate here. In China, somebody who's trying to be differential would be sure that the top of the glass is lower. And that is something I wouldn't even observe if I didn't know that was a thing. So now I think about that. That's a high context culture. And now every time I'm clinking the glass, I think, do people know, or where are they putting that glass? And then it'd be interesting to observe in different cultures. But that was illuminating.
Yeah, and also the power of observation is that it's almost like when you, and maybe this is true in anybody's case, when you go to a different culture, a different country, for example, the smells are different, the sights are different, the noise is different. And so our senses become heightened. We become very, very heightened with our senses. And so just in that alone is very important. And it goes back to the idea of protocol, that it's just much more protocol. Another thing that to kind of say what you were mentioning before about China, in South Korea, I noticed that all the time when the hand is reached down, I'm going to sit back a little bit so you can see this. When somebody hands something to you, whatever, a paper or business card even.
The second hand, yeah.
Because if you just put one hand, and this is the same with Japan and I believe Asian, definitely, it's like here, it's like a sign, not so respectful, just one hand.
Mm-hmm.
So with Japan, of course, it's both hands. China, I would try to use both hands as well. I would guess. See, another thing, if you don't know, you guesstimate with what you know and you carry it. In Korea, the line is not broken, you see. You don't want to break the line. And it's more for females to do this. All right, so it's anything that they hand you. Also, the idea, there's after work activities. It's very important, especially in Japan, that you go with the team and the boss, and you go to a bar after work, or you go to eat something. And so it's very important you have a glass, and the boss, who's ever the highest in the group, the lower ones, so to speak, they must pour the drink for the boss. The boss does not pour his or her own drink. It's going to be his, but they don't pour. So you'll see the Korean, like if I have a glass here and I'm going to pour, and I'm going to keep this so I don't break the line, and I'm going to pour that in there. And that's something that you don't want to do in that environment, is pour your own drink. They should be pouring it for you. Yeah, it's these little things, and they're important. And I really emphasize around social time, you see, because often eating is a sign of etiquette. It's a sign of education, like how the table manners. So table manners vary from culture to culture. And, with Brazilian and a lot of the European culture, it's knife and fork together. And you eat like this, you don't eat with one hand. And so that's just very important in the Brazilian frame of mind, is the table, the etiquette. You don't touch the food. Like here, we touch chicken and watermelon and, nachos and pizza. In Brazil, you don't eat pizza with your hands. You can when you're at home.
We went through this in France because they would say, oh, you put your elbows on the table. That's good. And I was raised never, don't even think about putting your elbows on the table.
That's right. Yeah. So what we're raised with, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how much of it can we unsocialize? And if you were going to continue to live in France, would it be a while before you put your elbows, or maybe it would be never that you put your elbows? So it's what we deem, how we grew up.
Yeah, I think also to the comments that were made about, traveling and having the luxury and the blessing to be able to do that and get exposure to other cultures and different ways of living, even just the differences in genders. I mean, I spent a little bit of time traveling in Japan, actually, and just kind of the role of women in that culture versus here in the States. It's dramatically different. And interesting kind of to be exposed to that firsthand. But it just gives you an interesting perspective when you come back home, for sure.
It really is. And gosh, and also, I mean, my mind's going in all different directions, but it's like going back, what is the mindset that operates those behaviors? You can learn the do's and don'ts in functioning in different cultures. That's fine. That's also very good. But what is more important is what's driving that behavior. And so you go in the iceberg, you go underneath the water, and you start reading books, watching movies, asking questions, all of these things, how we gradually pick this up.
Yeah,
So
the history of how it's gotten to that place and continues to exist today, versus looking at the history of women in this country and how there's just a history of kind of striving for equality, et cetera. It is fascinating how it's so different across the world.
Yeah, it is. You're right. It is. And I think the big piece of that is to minimize the judgment. Until we, the Indian, the Native American walk a mile in their shoes, we need to really kind of practice minimizing the judgment. And that's not always easy, but I think the more that we practice, the better that we can do much better in engaging with differences.
Mm-hmm.
Kathy, when I traveled to India, in my class, there was a gentleman who is Indian, Southeast Asian, and I talked with him before traveling. And one of the things he said, coincidentally, exactly what you said, in terms of when you get off that plane, the first thing you're going to do, your senses are going to be overwhelmed. The sound, the noise, the smell, the closeness of everybody. So it all rang very true. And then the other thing that I found interesting was when we were in business meetings, there were a lot of women leaders there and their voices were heard. But when we traveled to an individual's home and we went there for dinner, it was completely different. The women went to another room to talk, to do what they, to prepare the meal or whatever. The men were in their area and they talked. There were some interesting customs that we learned about how you enter their house, how you communicate with them, who you communicate with. So it was a crash course on landing on how to, the behaviors that I had to learn quickly on, in the business world in India, and then in the individual home life of the folks in India. So it's fascinating.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And isn't there a lot to learn?
Oh, I was overwhelmed. And
you say India,
the business card too.
Oh, and in India, it's not about I'm from India, then they have something in common with each other. It's not that. It's 27 different countries inside of India.
And they're very different in each area of the country.
Yes.
All of the different states. It was a fascinating culture.
Yes. Well, thank you thank you for sharing that. That's just delightful. And I think that is also like learning from each other and hearing these stories is just tremendous. And so the next session, which is only 3 weeks from now, we're going to pick up on the 4 other cultural lens. And one is having to deal with hierarchy, having to deal with relationship building, collectivism, and linear, I believe, is the other one. So what I wanted to do today was kind of give an overview, the iceberg theory, and then also kind of like, okay, what is culture anyway? And then now we're going to go much more into the lenses. And I think it's very valuable that we also have time to share our experiences and contributions to it. I think it's fantastic. So thank you. Even without the power of the internet, we were able to do this. So thank you very much. Gracias.
Oh, yes. Muchas gracias. Thank you. I think we are able to record this. We are able to catch people up. So the many, many people interested in this will get to catch up on the cultural iceberg and join us for the next session. So I thank you, Kathy Ellis, and those of you who have power and were able to join us. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any questions, feel free to email me anytime. Thank you very much.